next type to go over is Booleans. And as usual, if you're coming from a different programming language, you already know all about Booleans. But Booleans basically evaluate to either true or false. And these are used, like any other type all the time. In JavaScript, you check if something is true. If yes, do something. If it's false, do something else, just as a simple example. And as usual, if we want to see that in the console, you can do console log true. Right? You can just do this, for example. You can see that it evaluates true. If we want to do false, we can do that as well. And we'll get into variables in another video, but basically you can assign a variable like this, which is assigning the value of whatever variable into the variable name. So for example, should be true equals true. And here, if I ever want to check what's the value of should be true, I can check that. So if, for example, we do console log should be true, right? At a very simple level, this is how variables work. You assign a value and it's stored in this variable. We check that, we see that this evaluates to true. We can also do a check here. So is this true? Right? I use the triple comparator here in JavaScript, which again we'll get into later on, but this is basically saying, is this perfectly equal to this? And in this case, let's see what it tells us. It's true. If we want to check, hey, is this thing false? Well, no. Now it evaluates to false, right? Because it's actually true, and we're checking, hey, is this thing false? No, it's not. And we will cover if-else statements as well later on, but if you wanted to see what that looks like, we could do something like if should be true is equal to true. We console log one thing, hello, else we can do something else. This var is not true. Right, so let's see what this if-else statement does. We run it. Okay, it evaluates to hello. If this were false, on the other hand, this would run the rest of the logic. This var is not true. Right, so just a really quick rundown of an if-else statement. That's how it works. And this is how we can use Booleans. And to test something else out, let's change this to this var. This var is true. And if we want to check out how, for example, we can use different types in here, well, there is a concept of null. So var should be null. And null here is basically us deliberately assigning a non-value to this variable. So if we now check this variable, so should be null, let's see what happens. Okay, this var is not true. So while this is technically an empty variable, it does evaluate to false, which is important to know. And if we want to console log out just this variable, for example, should be null, let's see what that tells us. Right? It just evaluates to null. Makes sense. And really any variable can be assigned to a Boolean value. And how that works is, and I'll leave this code up there for reference, and I'll just comment it out. How that works is if something has been assigned a value, for the most part, it will evaluate to true. So, again, just to take a quick look at a variable here. Variable has content, for example, not the most creative variable name, but this can be anything, just kind of a random string. And if we want to evaluate, is this true? So console log has content equal true. Whoops, too many equal signs. Is that equal to true? Let's see what it tells us. False. But we can use this Boolean keyword and kind of wrap it around inside of that. So this will tell us, is this true? So if I get rid of equals true, this is something that we really rarely do ourselves in JavaScript, but there is a way to check what something evaluates to as a Boolean. Right, so here we're checking, does this evaluate to true or false? In this case, it evaluates to true because there has been content assigned to this variable. On the other hand, if we do something like this, var does not have content, we just make it an empty string like that. Let's see what that evaluates to. Does not have content. Okay, we'll clear it, we'll run it again, and this one evaluates to false. which I think is really important to know when you're dealing with Booleans. So just as a quick run through of the other types that will evaluate to false, we can have something like var is 0. Let's see what that evaluates to if we run our Boolean check on it. Let's check here. Is 0. Clear it. We run it again. Evaluates to false. What about if 0, despite the name, was 1? Let's see. Okay, this now evaluates to true. All right, so actually let me add a comment in here. The following evaluates to false, and the following evaluates to true. Other types that will evaluate to false, we can do something like var non-assigned variable. Notice that I didn't assign it any value. So if, for example, we do a console log of this non-assigned variable just to see what it is, we can check that. We clear, run it again. We can see that it evaluates to undefined, right? And if we check type of what is this thing, we see it's undefined. Okay, therefore that should give us a hint as to what will happen here. And in fact, the fact that I put it under evaluates to false should be even more hint, but we can check. Non-assigned variable, what does this evaluate to as a Boolean? This will evaluate to false. Right, so here we are basically just initializing it, not giving it a value. And in other words, we're making this variable available for us to use later. And again, we will get into variables in a later video. Another thing that evaluates to false is, of course, the type false. So var is false equals false. This will, of course, evaluate to false. Not even going to bother testing that one because it's so plainly clear. We also have the type NaN, not a number. So var is not a number equals NaN, for example. This could be useful if you want to make sure something is never a number, right? You can do kind of a comparison if you ever need to. But this one, let's check it out. We know what will happen, but just as a sanity check, is not a number. Clear, run it again, evaluates to false. And so, like I said, it's rare. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever done this in an actual app to just straight up check a Boolean there, because JavaScript will kind of do that conversion for you if you are doing something that expects a true or false value. And for that reason, it's often called truthy or falsy, because something like this var content has true values, and these have false values. When something has a truthy value, for example, this has a truthy value, evaluate to true. And just to look at another different data type, which we're going to be exploring a bit later, we have something called arrays. So if we have something called my array, we use square brackets for that. An array is basically values separated by a comma, like so. So here we have an array of strings, and each string is representing a number. So we can evaluate this entire array if we do something like this. So console log boolean my array, and this will evaluate true because this has truthy values. What about if we had an empty array like this? Right, so we have an array, but there's nothing in it. Let's see what that evaluates to. Okay, this still evaluates to true. Because if we needed something to be undefined, we would have to do it like the way we've seen before. So this will evaluate to false. Otherwise, it has some form, it just doesn't have anything inside the array. So just something to be aware of. Right? And this can have any kind of stuff. You could have mixed type of stuff in here, for example. And this will still evaluate to true, of course, because it doesn't really matter what's inside. What matters is that it exists. And when I say it kind of automatically uses this Boolean conversion for us, that's when JavaScript is doing some kind of method or function or if statement that is taking in a Boolean. So it can only take in a Boolean. And an if statement can only take in a Boolean. And again, we will explore this in a later video. But we can say if my array, and what it's doing here is basically doing this. So inside the if statement, it's saying Boolean my array. So what does this statement evaluate to? But we can skip that. We can say if my array console log has truthy values, else console log has falsy values. Right? And we can try out this if statement with a couple of our different variables. Let's see what this evaluates to. Right? This one has truthy values, therefore this returns true. If it's checking Boolean, what is this type of thing? Right? And we already know has content will evaluate to true. Right? We could check that here, and we can check is false. Let's see what happens if we check is false. This one has falsy values. In fact, this one just has the false value, not falsy. But if we check, for example, is 0, we know what will happen, right? Has falsy values, does not have content. What does this evaluate to? Of course, has falsy values. So everything down here will evaluate to false because they have falsy values. And final note on Booleans is that null is not the same thing as undefined. So if we want to check that out, we can do something just simple like is null equal to undefined. Let's see what this gives us. And it's getting angry because I don't have a semicolon here. Right, so this is false. So null and undefined are not the same thing. And think of it this way, null is when you deliberately do not assign any kind of value. Undefined, on the other hand, it just might not currently be defined, but it might be expecting a value later on. In other words, it's kind of an uninitialized value. So keep that in mind. These are not the same thing. So if you're doing some kind of logic that requires null to be the same as undefined, well, it's not going to work out because null is not the same thing as undefined.